My name is Henna Tailor. My research focuses on exploring the discourses of South Asian American high school students. Today, I'll provide an overview of the current problem, purpose for the study, the literature review, theoretical framework, and methodology. A majority of my presentation will focus on the findings and contributions to the literature and theory. A large problem stands within the Asian group as there are over 300 languages and about 34 varying ethnic groups, but more often than not are racially consolidated under the Asian American label. The classification of Asian American is a broad umbrella term encompassing a diverse range of cultures and ancestral homelands. The South Asian diaspora, consisting of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, is just one facet of this multifaceted identity. However, this categorization is not without its paradoxes. On one hand, the model minority stereotype popularized by Pedersen in 1966 characterizes Asian Americans as high achieving and successful. Yet this label coexists with the perpetual foreigner stereotype distinguished by Musaeus in 2014, which casts Asian Americans as outsiders, regardless of their citizenship or length of residency in the United States. Additionally, Asian Americans can experience both invisibility, as their unique experiences are often overlooked or ignored, and hypervisibility, as they are often subject to racial profiling and discrimination. Discourses such as these can place unfitting pressures and expectations from educational settings and from families, friends, peers, and educational institutions. A lack of understanding of these discourses can also result in the invisibilization of those students because they are often expected to do very well or are seen as the problem child. Disaggregated data needs to be used to allow a focus on Asian American ethnicities and subgroups so that these problems can be addressed specifically and especially in educational settings. My study focused on using purposeful sampling to help address this problem. However, as I explain later, there were limitations to the sampling as well. The purpose of this narrative study was to understand the unique experiences of South Asian students at Z High School. Previous studies have primarily focused on South Asian immigrants or their relationship to the black-white tension. However, there is a present need to uncover the experiences of South Asian students beyond their immigration waves, acculturation, and assimilation. South Asian voices need to be heard, but their identities, the formation of them, also need to be understood. For my study, the term South Asian was used instead of Asian American to refer to high school students with an South Asian origin or background. This helps shed light on the lived experiences of South Asian students and their diasporic and academic identities. Furthermore, this study explored how stereotypes and assumptions associated with the Asian American label affected individuality and differences between ethnicities and identities. Identity is a narrative of the self that is encompassed within discourse and derives from culture. The definition of culture remains fluid, including ethnic and national identity, which are then shaped by society and ethnic communities. Ultimately, this study aims to investigate how the Asian American label affects the diasporic and academic identities of South Asian high school students. Diasporic identity refers to the preservation of ethnic identity from their country of origin as a transnational community in another place, allowing for multiple navigations and pathways. My overarching and main research question asks, what discourses of racial and ethnic categories do South Asian students navigate in a Northeast regional independent high school? More specifically, I also conducted research around two sub-questions. How do these discourses influence their academic identities? And how do South Asian students navigate their diasporic identity within academic spaces? My why for this study has been simply stated since the beginning of my doctoral journey. I want more. A lot of my study has depicted how there are generational and learned behaviors of survival due to colonialism and assimilation, where instead of communication and helping, we fight and claw figuratively. The wounds end up being so deep, depression is almost guaranteed, but still no one acknowledges it. When my narratives have been shared by others, it makes me wonder why. Why did they seem to feel so privileged to do so? Why did they think it was their right to share? Or why did I share that with them in the first place? Maybe because we place so many expectations on ourselves, and in doing so, we expect the same of others. I'm not sure, maybe all of it. When my narratives have been shared by others without consent, I have felt powerless. I shut down. I shut them out. And slowly, I have unlearned those response mechanisms to accept. Those are the reasons I teach, because every single person has a story, no matter their characteristics or who they are as a person. Their stories are not mine to share without consent, but I have to use my voice, because if I do not, I will continue to think I have to go at it all on my own, and I don't. I am not alone, and slowly the participants in my research came to the same conclusion. But I do know that what I want is more, and that's my why. My literature review looked at the construction of Asian American labels. Lee and Rice have highlighted how the generalization of Asian Americans as a single collective obscures nuanced experiences, including academic and economic success. For example, Southeast and South Asian refugees typically face low socioeconomic status, where success is not as prevalent as the aggregated data on Asian Americans suggests. The aggregate label has led to misrepresentation due to invisibility and essentially homogenization. Another example is how many Punjabis immigrated to the United States during the second wave of immigration when skilled professionals were in demand, while Pakistanis and Bangladeshis fled their countries as refugees. Consequently, many educational degrees from Pakistan and Bangladesh are not accredited in the United States, leading to fewer opportunities for academic and economic prosperity. The three waves of immigration to the United States directly affected South Asians' economic success or poverty, as policies passed either granted or excluded them from immigration. The first wave of immigration occurred around the 20th century when South Asian immigrants sought citizenship and many were subsequently stripped of their granted status. The second wave sought skilled professionals, while the third wave comprised refugees. Today, some South Asians are among the wealthiest 1% in the United States, while others live well below the poverty line. Unfortunately, data on Asian Americans often prioritizes the former over the latter. Moreover, scholars, including those in the fields of AsianCrit, categorize Asian Americans under a blanket term, often unintentionally excluding South Asians from their research. For instance, in 1998, Blair and Kean explored the academic performance of Asian Americans, but only discussed Chinese, Filipino, Korean, Southeast Asian, and Japanese families. For decades, the Supreme Court vacillated between classifying South Asians as either non-white or white until the 1980 census officially designated them as Asian minority group, Asian Indian. 1980, only 45 years ago. With that, the model minority myth perpetuates the notion that South Asians are white adjacent, which can have positive or negative implications for their identity within the diaspora. For a while, South Asians were deemed as white, while at other periods of time they were labeled as non-white. Through the civil rights movement and with a fight for minority status, slowly labels were constructed, such as model minority or perpetual foreigner, and being labeled as white was not possible. However, honorary white status still exists and coincides with the model minority today, influencing political power, perspectives, and society. The research begins to get interesting when South Asians are included in the sampling, as they have often been excluded in past research. Concepcion et al. Conducted a quantitative study on racial identity, acculturation, and racial experiences among Asian Americans, which included a small sample of Indians, 0.5% of total participants, and it is unclear if other South Asians were included. However, the large majority of participants were East or Southeast Asian, with many South Asian ethnicities not represented. Pang, Han, and Pang used the category of Asian Indian to depict data on Bengali, Indian, Nepalese, and Sri Lankan participants. However, those ethnicities are vastly different regarding their culture, opportunities, experience, economic status, religion, and possibly their education attainment. Many would argue that this grouping is a misrepresentation, as Bengali, Nepalese, Pakistani, and Sri Lankans may not identify or self-identify as Asian Indian. Aggregate data on Asian American students can be misleading and result in inaccurate conclusions. In conclusion of this literature review, research indicates a conspicuous absence of South Asian student perspectives in academic literature, indicating a disjunction between the experiences of these students and the dominant societal norms. This disconnect stems from stereotypical assumptions ingrained in social structures and the education system, resulting in disparities and invisibility. Furthermore, diverse South Asian ethnicities encounter diasporic pressures, which, when combined with academic and social pressures, exacerbate the inequitable labeling of South Asians and leading them to be viewed differently from their Asian American peers. Although Asian Americans are grouped with all Asian American ethnicities and perceived to share the same cultural values and education, some studies have begun to focus on South Asians and the patterns that emerge. However, to further develop this field of research, it is necessary to examine the educational experiences of these students, as their cultural background and identity may result in different expectations and pressures, where is my study comes into play and contributes to the current body of literature. For my research, I used AsianCrit, an extension of critical race theory, to analyze how assumptions impacted the academic performance and social emotional state of South Asian high school students, specifically related to discourses such as model minority, perpetual foreigner, and invisibility. AsianCrit, first conceptualized by Robert Chang in 1993, aims to address racial inequalities and examine the stereotypes that influence experiences as Asian Americans, but for my study, South Asian. Asianization, transnational context, reconstructive history, strategic anti-essentialism, intersectionality, story theory and praxis, and commitment to social justice are the 7 tenets of AsianCrit, each crucial to understanding Asian American and South Asian experiences. Assumptions such as minor minority and perpetual foreigner labels are paradoxical and result from hypervisibility or invisibility, demonstrating the Asianization and strategic anti-essentialism that has occurred and remains present today. These labels also stem from transnational contexts of various perspectives about Asian Americans as they immigrated to the United States. Assumed stereotypes and labels disrupt the identities and experiences of South Asians, and using the AsianCrit framework, I aimed to determine patterns of these false assumptions and stereotypes within the South Asian community. The specific tenets that were threaded through this research are Asianization, transnational context, reconstructive history, strategic anti-essentialism, and intersectionality. Through the theoretical framework of AsianCrit, I was able to determine patterns of various discourses that were false assumptions and stereotypes within the South Asian communities, therefore affecting the experiences of South Asian students. This study stands as a commitment to social justice for South Asian students, and also how their stories and theories can be used in praxis, encompassing all 7 tenets of AsianCrit. Moving on to my methodology, the study used a qualitative narrative research design to collect the voices of South Asian students through their narratives and counter-stories. The purpose of this narrative inquiry was to challenge assumptions, provide a platform for unheard voices, humanize participants, and explore ways of belonging beyond quantitative research. Once appropriate consent was provided, a Qualtrics survey was emailed to collect background information for sampling to occur. If a volunteer chose not to share certain information, that was entirely up to them. This data was used to help probe questions during the interview, as well as further analyze the data from the interview. Individual interviews were scheduled within 4 weeks following the initial recruitment email and Qualtrics survey. Since there were not many volunteers, the students who did volunteer became the participants who were interviewed for this study. These interviews served as a platform to share lived experiences and personal narratives. The interviews took about 3 to 4 months, depending on the availability of participants. In turn, the data collection shifted from purposeful sampling to snowballing to maximize number of recruits. Based on the data collected from the individual interviews, 7 participants were selected for a focus group, however, only 5 accepted. The semi-structured interview and focus group protocols contain questions that explore the participants' background, experiences as a South Asian student, and encounters with their stereotypes and expectations. The focus group that was facilitated was used to further discuss the participants' experiences as South Asians, aiming to uncover similarities, patterns, and differences between the participants. To ensure convenience and accessibility, a virtual Zoom interview was an option. This enabled multiple recording methods, including live transcription and audio recording using Otter AI. Participants also had the opportunity to review their interview transcripts to add, amend, or make changes. This member checking process was designed to enhance transparency and trustworthiness. The research was conducted at Z High School, an independent institution located in the Northeast region of the United States. These 2 graphs depict the self-identified demographics of the students for 2021 to 2022, showing the large percentage of Asian students at Z High School, and the self-identified demographics of students for the 2023-2024 school year, which is when the data was collected. A significant change in labeling is how Caucasian was adjusted to European, which also has to do with the formulation of a European affinity space. The large Asian population is also peculiar to some suburban areas in the Northeast, where a minority race is the majority, but moreover, Asians are the majority. To create a sampling of participants, an email was sent to the student body with inclusion criteria: 1, being born in the United States; 2, identifying as South Asian; and 3, currently attending Z High School. Parental consent was necessary for any students under 18 years of age. The Qualtrics survey was added after the initial IRB and proposal approval, as I realized that background information prior to selecting participants, if more than 18 volunteers were recruited for interviews, would be crucial and could have a positive effect on my variation by allowing for more purposeful, criterion-based sampling, as well as more in-depth analysis. However, since that was not the case, the survey was used to help structure each interview protocol. Although about 54.55% of the participants identified themselves as Indian, the sampling provided variation depicting the many ethnicities and religions within one region alone, specifically India. In addition, some participants' backgrounds were not Indian, which provided insight into similarities and differences among South Asians. When probed further during the interview process, some participants delved further into their ethnicity. There was a commonality of sharing more specificity regarding their ethnicity, which depended on whom they were talking to. Some participants also used their religion as an identifier, which connects to the mix of geographical, racial, ethnic, and religious identifiers. In hopes of finding a correlation or a small pattern, I also asked about sexual orientation. I wanted to gauge whether there was more, less, or no difference in pressure depending on a person's sexual orientation, especially regarding their relationships with peers, friends, and family. However, there was not a large significance that was portrayed through my study, but the possibility of a finding coming of it creates room for more research with the requirement to have a more niche sampling. From the collected data, it is clear that each self-identified ethnicity was more than the original information provided from the Qualtrics survey. Roosh shared that he identified more with the South Asian and Indian labels, even though specifically he is Sindh and a quarter Gujarati. When it came to looking at his ethnic background, Roosh shared that he identified more with his Sindh identity than his Gujarati identity. This table, along with Roosh's experience, all are critical as there are clear distinctions and further descriptors about self-identity compared to categorical identity on government forms. There is also much diversity within the Asian American category, more so the South Asian category, supporting the tenet of Asianization. As for generations at home, the information was used to describe the family unit within the household. This meant the participant and siblings were one generation, their parents as another generation, grandparents as another generation, and etc. Generations at home could stand as an indicator of holding on to desi values or traditional parenting, thereby influencing a participant's identity. Shreya and Shan shared that at times there were 3 generations of family that lived in their household, but it varied as they grew up. Preeti and Jasleen shared that there were 3 generations at home because their grandparents lived with them, and the rest of the participants had 2 generations living at home. In addition, regarding generation, Shreya was the only participant who was second generation born in the United States. This particular information is important as it helps illuminate finding 2B and allows for a compare and contrast regarding how each participant was raised, what expectations were placed on them, and whether generations impacted those decisions and experiences. Furthermore, the generation column highlights how there remains a wave of South Asian immigration to the United States, resulting in a significant presence of first-generation born South Asian Americans. With traditions and holding onto transnational contexts, arranged marriages have been the pathway. However, as time progresses and there is an adaptation to the American culture, that may not always be the case. Finding out about how parents met was another concept I thought might affect how those parents raised their children. However, nothing was unveiled to determine a solid pattern. For those that had arranged marriages, there was more pressure present, but it is difficult to determine with such a small sampling. This can also be further looked into in future studies. For the focus group, there were 5 participants: Huda, Jashan, Roosh, Shan, Shreya. Preceding the focus group, a feedback survey was shared which gauged how comfortable the participants were at the beginning of the focus group versus the end. This survey was entirely anonymous and was important to me as a researcher as it allowed me to reflect on my position as a researcher as well as a person that each participant could trust. The results of the survey depicted a growth in comfort. The graphs also portrayed the comfort level of the participants in the room, increasing from a level of either 3, 5, or 6 to a level of 7, 8, or 9. This indicates the importance of building trust and rapport to create safe and brave spaces, which also indicates the importance of using a qualitative method for this study. It was important for me to mention that I identify as South Asian, was one of the teachers at that middle school. I have also been an advisor for the South Asian Student Association Affinity Group, which is another reason this setting was chosen, as it follows one of the recommendations from Vyas's study regarding affinity groups. This information was crucial in establishing rapport and trust with the participants, ensuring transparency in the research process, and avoiding conflicts of interest. Tracy indicates the need for sincerity, rich rigor, credibility. Therefore, conducting a qualitative study was not only due to the triangulation aspect, but to be able to parse narratives and not simply look at numbers, which is how Asian Americans are often looked at, as quantitative data. With consistent reflection through journal memos and multiple data sources, I was able to find patterns. As you can see the codebook on your screens, the analysis of the study should help to inform future research and aid with pre-coding, as there are preconceived notions regarding labels and stereotypes. The first iteration of the coding scheme was initially developed from the pilot study codebook and was followed by 2 rounds of coding with refinement after each cycle as the sample and data set were analyzed. The first 2 interviews, Huda's and Roosh's, were coded with the pilot study codebook. However, as more interview transcripts were coded, the pilot study codebook started to shift. The first round of coding used the pilot study codebook and was adjusted via an elemental method, in vivo coding. This was used on both the interviews and the focus group transcripts only after respective member checks were completed. The codebook was finalized on deduce after the first cycle of coding. Patterns coding was then used as a second cycle of coding, also on both measures. The coding decisions were based on the methodological needs of the study, as interview transcripts were used as the primary source of the data collection, where participant perspectives were shared using in vivo coding, and a way to categorize the codes was crucial through patterns coding. This study illuminated three main findings, revealing how expectations of stereotypes and the level of support from parents influence identity and pressures put on self. This is apparent regarding choices in friends and expectations from friends as well. In addition, there was a stark discovery regarding connection and discomfort. The findings from the study contribute to the literature regarding South Asian high school student experiences through an AsianCrit lens, and also provide insight into 1. How the identities of South Asian students are shaped due to stereotypes encountered, expectations due to those stereotypes, and pressures from social constructs. 2. How assumptions are placed on students from friends and parents. And 3. The unwavering desire for connection. Each finding was interlaced with each other as they supported the notion of various discourses that students navigated as South Asian students. They navigated encountering stereotypes that sometimes felt a pressure to fulfill those stereotypes. These pressures and expectations also stemmed from parents and friends. Regarding the latter, participants in grades 11 and 12 shared how they were very particular with whom they surrounded themselves with, and the kinds of friends they chose to remain close to. In addition, there was an overall need and desire for connection, whether it was from peers, friends, parents, or the school. Each finding is separated to show the discourses of racial and ethnic categories that students navigated, and moreover how there were numerous factors that shaped their identity, beginning with socially constructed stereotypes to the details of generations in their homes. The concept of strategic anti-essentialism is vividly illustrated in this study, as socially constructed stereotypes surrounding race significantly influence identities of participants. Among the stereotypes explored were those related to beauty standards, athleticism, the perpetual foreigner, and the model minority. Each stereotype rooted in racial constructs played a pivotal role in shaping the participants' identities, both academically and within their diasporic communities. Regarding beauty standards, Huda, Jasleen, Preeti, Shan, and Shreya discussed how these standards affected their self-preconception, often through comparisons to others. While some resisted these comparisons, others struggled with insecurities. In terms of athleticism, Unveil, Huda, and Rush challenged the stereotype of non-athleticism by engaging in sports that defy societal norms. The perpetual foreigner stereotype, perpetuated by media narratives, revealed a more insidious form of racial profiling, particularly affecting South Asian men with beards and turbans, as highlighted by Jashan and Rush's experiences. Meanwhile, the model minority stereotype was universally acknowledged by participants as a source of pressure, and with influences stemming from family, friends, and societal expectations. Each participant's narrative demonstrated the pervasive impact of these stereotypes, shaping their identities and the pressures they faced in various contexts. Huda, Jashan, Leela, and Sahana noted that this pressure often originated from their friends, while Huda, Jashan, and Rush also pointed to family as a source of expectation. Rush remarked on the general societal pressure and contrasted it with negative stereotypes, and Jasleen, Preeti, and Shan echoed this societal influence. Shreya attributed these expectations to her grandparents, and Unvi shared that she felt compelled to conform, affecting her sense of authenticity. Anisha, although aware of the stereotype, had not personally encountered it. Overall, all participants acknowledged the stereotype's presence, with Shan specifically referencing as part of the model minority concept. Unvi's use of terms like geeky and obliging underscores the personality traits associated with the stereotype. Collectively, this insight reveals the pervasive pressures and expectations stemming from the model minority stereotype impacting individuals through various societal and social circles. As portrayed, there are distinct individual social constructs, and at the same time, they are also relational. Strategic anti-essentialism, a tenet of AsianCrit, portrays the socially constructed stereotypes which regard race and influence the various identities of each participant. As concerns about beauty standards and athleticism were voiced, each expectation and standard continued to interlace with model minority or perpetual foreigner, where model minority stood as a positive expectation and the perpetual foreigner indicated a negative influence, supporting Ghaffar Kutr's 2012 study, who outlined the negative influence of religification and perpetual foreigner. Their study focused on Pakistani Americans, however, the assumptions made connect to this study's finding of social constructs and their influences. Although the model minority was indicated as a stereotype surrounded by much expectation and pressure, resulting in possible negative influences, for this specific mapping, it is used as a positive entity because of how social constructs view and hold South Asians to the positive perspective of model minorities. This depicts strategic anti-essentialism because of how the socially constructed stereotypes influence the expectations and identities of each participant by factors of economy, politics, and society, further supporting Mucius and Iphthiker's study. Furthermore, the concept of the physical identity was discovered with examples including clothing and outerwear, skin color, and weight. Clothes included articles like hijab or a turban. Skin color regarded the lightness or darkness of it. And although weight was only directly noted by Sean, there were nonverbal cues and gestures made during the interview and focus group that indicated discomfort with their outward appearance by Huda and Rush. Finding 2 is split into 2 subsections as the overarching summary of Finding 1 displays the assumptions evolved into stereotypes, which then slowly turned into expectations resulting in pressure. This specific finding needed to be narrowed down as 2 clear distinct pathways, Finding 2A and Finding 2B. Finding 2A regards the assumptions and expectations and the pressures that revolve around friends and peers. Finding 2B relates the assumptions and expectations and pressures that derive from family. This specific finding focuses on friends and answers research question A and B regarding how South Asian students navigate their academic identity as well as their diasporic identity within academic spaces. It also supports a literature review regarding academic pressures and expectations at school, except the following outlined expectations that come from participants' friends, whether South Asian or not. At school, there is a presence of intersectionality concerning race, expectations from friends, and identity. The choice of friends affects the outlook on self-confidence, where the conscious choice is made to involve supportive, understanding, and open friends compared to friends who do not understand or friends you cannot communicate with or relate to. This then results in no actual close friends and a feeling of disconnect. When some participants like Jasleen and Shreya shared that they were surrounded by support on purpose, it portrayed a distinct difference in the kinds of expectations that were placed on them by their friends compared to those who became friends with their peers. Huda, Jashan, Preeti, Rush, and Sahana shared how sometimes their friends put pressures and expectations on them. These expectations varied, not all regarded only academia, but also their diasporic identities, and although different, remained present for Jasleen, Sean, and Shreya as well. Sahana, Jasleen, Sean, and Shreya held these expectations for themselves more so than they felt it from their peers. More specifically, they found that their friends were comparing themselves to them. In contrast, Anisha, Anvi, and Leela felt as though they did not have any expectations from their friends except to simply be a friend. In summary, all participants felt as though they belonged at their school, but sometimes felt expectations and pressures placed on them to fulfill stereotypes, as well as perform academically well. When they did not fulfill the expected academic identity, each participant put pressure on themselves at one point or another. Anisha, Anvi, Leela, and Preeti shared that they had to unlearn this kind of thinking. Jasleen, Sean, and Sherry indicated how they have to intentionally stop themselves from placing so much pressure on themselves that they reach a breaking point, indicating how they purposely take care of their mental health. Sean seemed to still be working through who his friends are. Although Huda noted expectations from her friends, she also indicated that she had begun to surround herself with people who have your back because we can really have deep conversations. The rest of the participants did not note a need to stop the pressure. However, Jashan, Rush, Sahana also shared how their friends placed academic expectations on them, so they also put those same expectations on themselves, whether they were successful in fulfilling them or in meeting them. The second part of Finding 2 highlights family. Parental expectations affect pressures placed on self, resulting in split or multiple identities that the participants navigate. This is outlined in the literature review, and some of the participants were raised by traditional parenting styles. This specific finding answers research question A and B regarding how South Asian students navigate their academic identity, as well as their diasporic identity within academic spaces. The intersectionality of socially constructed stereotypes that are then sometimes endorsed through parental expectations in a clash or tension for the participant. Past the academic or diasporic identity, some participants shared how the expectations that are placed on them at home versus how they carry themselves in the school environment causes code switching. For the participants of this study, code switching occurred from circumstance to circumstance regarding who was present and where they were. The transnational contexts of holding on to traditions, cultures, and the ways of life connecting them back to their origin is held onto by some of the parents of the participants like Huda, Jashan, Jasleen, Preeti, Rush, Sahana, and Sean. This emphasizes that how parents grew up affected how they raised their kids, whether they were in the United States for quite a while or if they realized the cycles they wanted to break based on how they were raised. Regarding split identities, Huda, Preeti, and Sahana indicated how they have one personality with mom versus how they carry themselves around dad. The identity that they share with mom is closer to who they are, allowing for connection and sense of belonging. The identity that they present to dad regards obligation and expectations. This is also possibly where sexual orientation comes into play, as Huda and Sahana did not identify as straight, and Preeti did not provide an answer as she did not want to share. As previously mentioned, Anisha, Jasleen, Leela, Shreya, and Shan all share that they were able to communicate with their parents without fear. Therefore, the pressures they felt were expectations they had held for themselves. Parental expectations for Rush and Jashan resulted in turning off their feelings when at home because they were expected to be strong and not show emotions as men. This figure indicates how diasporic identity and the expectations of the diasporic identity from peers, friends, and family may influence the following pathways. This does not guarantee that, for example, diasporic identity leads to family and desi values, but that diasporic identity may impossibly influence family and desi values. However, each pathway results in multiple identities being created past the diasporic identity, academic identity, and model minority identity. The model minority identity and the academic identity go hand in hand, as the academic identity derives from the socially constructed, strategically labeled model minority stereotype. Although the model minority myth stands as a stereotype that was socially constructed, the study portrays the internalization of that stereotype, turning it into a personal and individual identity. There is also the addition of mental health that comes into play, as expectations and pressures may become a negative influence, as trying to be the best and always coming in first may not be achievable at all times. Coupled with Lee and Rotharam Boris's 2004 findings about struggles with parental communication, mental health has a negative impact on South Asian students due to pressures and expectations. These expectations and pressures are fostered through family and desi values regarding transnational contexts, in tandem with the importance of place on education. Mental health is an aspect that needs to be considered regarding South Asian identities. However, this was not the focus of my study and can be further researched in the future. In conclusion of finding 2, academic and diasporic identities were not the only identities that participants identified with. There were multiple identities created, and each dependent on who they were interacting with and what the situation was. As previously mentioned, stereotypes that were encountered derived from social contracts that had been built over time and have slowly turned into expectations from friends. Those expectations have also trickled into parental expectations and resulted in a disconnect and longing for connection, and in other instances there is the presence of connection and belonging. This third finding answers the main research question regarding the discourses that South Asian students navigate in high school, more specifically the discourses and connection of belonging. This finding also relates to the mental health aspects that can occur supporting the literature review. Huda, Preeti, Rush, and Sahana indicated depression or the need to go to therapy as a result of the pressure that they felt. As a result of going to therapy, they each have been able to respectively indicate that the part of their identity that was missing was a sense of connection and approval. While Huda and Preeti both felt as though they had a relationship with their moms, they did not feel the same towards their dads. Huda emphasized her mom as her best friend, and Preeti noted how she hides much less from her mom than she does from her dad. When each participant defined belonging, there was a consensus. Jasleen shared that belonging is your ability to feel like you can be yourself. Each participant felt a sense of belonging in their school, and this finding further supports the findings revealed in the pilot study. However, a significant aspect that was highlighted from the first cycle of coding was how, even with the sense of belonging and how belonging was defined, some participants like Rush still desired a connection. With the feeling of belonging, there was a paradoxical and simultaneous feeling of discomfort because cultural aspects seemed to not be understood to their fullest extent. This is also rooted in miscommunication of clashing with expectations and sometimes inconsistency. Representation and training are necessary in order for connections to be built, as Shreya and Jasleen pointed out. However, when expectations were placed on each participant, a few shared how they felt guilt for not fulfilling parental expectations because they felt, as Unvi described, obliged to fulfill them. There was a disconnect between parents confusing obligation with connection, hence a distinct longing, which was portrayed by Huda, Jashan, Rush, and Sahana. For their parents, the obligation to fulfill expectations was seen as a connection due to accomplishment. The data collected portrayed that depending on who the participant were talking to, they may or may not specify or disclose their ethnicity and still stick to the broader and commonly known identifiers such as South Asian or Indian, even with their pride for their ethnicity. Preeti indicated that Indian was no longer an identifier for her, but instead has begun to identify as Punjabi due to the politics and current events in India regarding people who follow the Hindu religion, people who follow the Sikh religion, and the Indian government. This example of racism directly depicts the tenet of transnational context and shows how Preeti felt, even though she felt like she belonged in some spaces and not others. Anisha indicated that even though she feels like she belongs now, she did not have that sense of feeling in previous years. She had friends from the same ethnic background who would make fun of her for not knowing about her diasporic identity, and that resulted in making the conscious decision to not be friends with them anymore, so that they were simply peers now. As a result, I found that for this specific school, affinity spaces had not been fostered in a way that allowed for connections to be made, although that was the intent. Shreya and Sean also agreed. However, Sean indicated that there were efforts being made by students. Furthermore, Shreya and Sean were seniors during this data collection, so would no longer be around for future changes or the work and process towards connection. This study contributes to the body of literature and supports the knowledge that currently exists in the field of South Asian narratives. It also expands to the influence of mental health on South Asians. By re-emphasizing and reinforcing the necessity for such research, the study provides representation of South Asian voices in a high school setting, while most narratives have been shared from a higher education perspective. This study also highlights the importance of connection and belonging relating back to the school climate, peer climate, and familial climate, which impact and influence identity. To look at the impact and influence using a theoretical lens is pertinent. Along with the need for more research and the addition to the current body of literature on South Asians, tenets can be divulged from the study to create a South Asian crit, or allow solidified tenets for Desi crit, as none have truly been created and only introduced by Harpalani in 2013. While the foundations of Desi crit have been theorized to encompass levels of whiteness, socio-historical racial theories, and social and political dynamics, additional tenets can be added which would derive from Asian crit, more specifically from Asianization, intersectionality, and transnational context. Through each participant's narrative, the study is an example of how such tenets can be incorporated to focus on Desis and South Asians. For Asianization, it would have to be specific to the South Asian diaspora, as South Asians are often referred to as Indian in aggregate, which is inaccurate. The tenets of intersectionality and transnational context would remain the same as they directly correlate to the South Asian experience. The added tenet of socio-historical labeling can be incorporated to merge levels of whiteness with socio-historical racial theories. This would allow a focus on the historical background of South Asians attempting to be labeled as white via legal processes, and also the subconscious embedding of attaining whiteness, extending on reconstructive history. The creation of another tenet, including social constructs, coupled with the expectations, can also be supported as finding one indicated various stereotypes, and as more research is conducted, more stereotypes may be unveiled, or the current stereotypes that were portrayed in this study may be further supported. Lastly, a general codebook of patterns can also exist or be created using Disaggregated, and similar to the codebook that was created and used for this study. With the pre-existing codebook, there would be more navigation throughout the study as narratives are analyzed, contributing more to the AsianCrit framework and theory. A codebook can be incorporated into the theory and this study, and the codebook can be used or replicated with differing parameters and criteria. The findings from my study also provide a push for more research and to extend the research so that it includes K-12 settings with a sampling focus on South Asians. This would enforce a subsect of AsianCrit, such as Disaggregated, to be further developed, and educational institutions can adapt to provide appropriate support for those respective South Asian students. Appropriate supports can come in the formation of affinity groups that center around anti-racism. In order for affinity groups to be appropriately implemented, they must focus around anti-racism and represent a space where narratives can be shared. This will require training to the leaders of the affinity groups as well as the educators or adults that are overseeing each group. Educators and adults need to be adequately equipped to handle circumstances that may arise and to build trust between the students in the affinity group and the person that is supervising them. Representation will also be pertinent here to build trust and cultivate a space where students can feel safe and brave, but it is not necessarily a requirement if training is conducted properly, which leads to the next implication. There needs to be a conscious and cognizant process implemented for hiring processes to directly correlate to the ethnic and racial backgrounds of the students at the school. When students cannot see themselves in their educators and adults in the building, they may not feel inclined to ask for help or share their narratives and experiences. Geography must also be taken into account, as research on South Asians could yield significantly different results. My study concentrated on a northeast region of the United States. However, conducting this research in the Midwest could alter both the sample and the generalization of my findings. Key factors as environment, geography, and demographics are crucial to the study, enabling a detailed examination of disaggregated racial and ethnic backgrounds. In my research, a considerable portion of participants identified as Asian, 40%, at my school. However, if the demographic were less than 10% Asian, with a different historical context than that of the Northeast, various influences could impact peer discourse, such as increased racism, a higher number of generations of South Asians residing in the West versus the Northeast, reduced representation in the educational environment, and peers from non-South Asian backgrounds. Future researchers must consider geography in their investigations. It is also essential to consider how religious subgroups perceive various racialized stereotypes, for example, Muslim Indian and Muslim Pakistani. The overlap of different types of racial stereotypes affects their identities and how others perceive them. My theoretical framework, along with the shared narratives of participants, emphasizes how stereotypes can be understood paradoxically. A person of South Asian descent may be seen as a perpetual foreigner while simultaneously being subjected to the mono-minority expectations. This dual existence creates additional complexities in identity formation and influence. Transnational contexts also play a role in this narrative as political circumstances surrounding anti-Muslim sentiment are a global issue. However, we can also look at the experience of Hindu nationalism or a Hindu student facing discrimination are two different entities, even though both scenarios are prevalent in the United States. Given the socially constructed tropes of Hinduphobia and Islamophobia, while both rooted in oppression, racism, and hate, they differ in the treatment of each religion and individual, thus influencing the formation of a person's identity. Religion plays a crucial role in shaping South Asian identities, having both negative and positive societal impacts. Intersectionality is also vital here, particularly regarding the intersection of oppression, be it economic status, class status, or self-identifiers. Although my research concentrated on the core components of AsianCrit, critical race theory, and historical influences, this data can also be analyzed using other frameworks while still employing these theories. The tenets of AsianCrit, especially intersectionality, transnational context, and strategic anti-essentialism, were instrumental in data collection and unveiling findings. However, they can be further explored to reveal the layers of oppression and the power dynamics that significantly affect participants via other frameworks and lenses. In my research, I utilized AsianCrit to focus on identity-related issues relevant to my role as an educator and researcher. However, by emphasizing oppression and the historical context of South Asian regions, one can intertwine these factors with their influence on participants, shaping their upbringing, beliefs, and choices. Lastly, I chose to employ discourse to define the experiences and pathways that South Asian students navigated within a high school context. However, discourse can also be approached differently, such as through discourse analysis. Future research could benefit from applying a discourse analysis framework to extend or support my current findings, highlighting the gaps that exist in the specific fields concerning South Asians in K-12 settings. One limitation of this study regards the recruitment sampling. The sampling for the study aimed to purposefully select 8 to 18 participants. However, with a small number of initial volunteers, specifically 3, snowballing was then used to help recruit more participants. Purposeful sampling was then adjusted to criterion-based sampling in combination with convenience sampling and snowballing. This limitation made it difficult to purposefully select with variation in mind regarding ethnicity, sex, and grade level. However, with the volunteers, it resulted in some variation to allow for in-depth analysis across South Asian students. Researchers that conduct studies that center South Asian students as a sampling should work for more variation or conduct studies that focus on a particular ethnicity or across multiple schools with similar demographics for a large South Asian population. Thereafter, comparisons can be made across ethnicities further than what this study was able to accomplish. Additionally, purposeful sampling to include more participants that vary in sex, gender, and grade level will also allow for discovery of possible differences and similarities. Another limitation concerning the variation in sampling regards the ages of students, where 45.45% of the participants were in the 9th grade compared to the seniors that encompassed 27.27% of the data. This comparison allowed me to look into the expectations from parents, from friends, and the types of stereotypes they encountered and how much connection they felt to a school. The maturity level and the self-esteem can be delved into to identify if participant age affects connection and open communication with parents versus the need to fulfill expectations due to obligation and guilt. Particularly the last point, the connection to the school, stands out as those 9th graders were only at the high school level for about 8 months, while many of other participants were a part of the high school for more than 18 months. For future development in this field, researchers can use their collected data to compare and contrast their analysis of various ages to see if that affects the way South Asian students navigate their identities, as this study was limited to a small sampling. As mentioned previously, when patterns coding was being described, some of the categories and patterns could be expanded. This research study can be furthered with a larger sampling to identify whether or not the patterns that were found remain true, or to see if patterns not emphasized or used became prominent in a larger sampling. Researchers can use a larger sampling within one school district or expand to crossover school districts with similar demographics. However, as a main point, there's a need for further research on South Asian student narratives in K-12 settings. It would be beneficial to expand on this study, making a conscious effort to address the limitations in the study and conduct research on a larger scale. This figure indicates the complexities and layers of cultivating and navigating the South Asian identity. The previously displayed mind maps evolved to shape this 1 indicating these complexities. Beginning on the left with the findings from this study, we see a direct effect on the expectations that are placed on self, but also a direct link to the cultivation and development of various identities: academic identity, diasporic identity, model minority identity, and physical identity. Each identity intertwines as the model minority identity influences the academic identity, as the model minority began as a social construct to help boost South Asians and Asians in general on the hierarchy scale of whiteness. With the historical and strategic context, South Asians have enabled the expectations to influence their diasporic identity as a part of who they are, which then merges or conflicts with the possible religious identities to be created. The physical identity comes into play in various forms. For some participants, it came in the form of looking a certain way, while for others it came in the form of religious clothing, therefore also leading to the creation of a religious identity. As a result of the pathways in navigation, a South Asian high school student may or may not know their sense of self as a whole, therefore the self is represented with a question mark behind it. However, each participant did indicate some reflection in a notion of knowing a various part of themselves versus other parts and identities. From this research, I found intertwining findings where social constructs existed paradoxically, resulting in varying racialized discourses associated with the Asian American categorization. This emphasized the necessity for disaggregated data to be used so as to highlight narratives and experiences of South Asian students. Although navigating varying discourses took form in many ways, each participant shared influences from family, friends, self, social constructs, and expectations, helping to answer the research questions of this study, warranting for more research, not only a larger sampling, but also a wider cast net within the South Asian diaspora. My aim was to contribute to the field of research by examining South Asian students' experiences through the lens of AsianCrit. While I acknowledge that my research may not fully encapsulate all experiences and serve as a comprehensive representation of the South Asian diaspora, it does, however, serve as a crucial starting point to identify the discourses that South Asian students encounter in a high school setting. Furthermore, such analysis has now uncovered the potential effects of these discourses on South Asian students and their identities. The study was not so I could put more of a label to my name or indicate some honor. Instead, my inadequacy was relinquished and diminished when I was able to hear these narratives that were shared with me. My imposter syndrome disappeared. My insecurities and anxiety around public speaking and sharing my knowledge slowly dwindled. And the narratives in this study were shared with me because I created a trusting space. I wish someone had done so for me, because it was not until I met my life partner that I really had that space. So as far as the dedication goes, this is for him, my husband, my partner in life, and all those stories that have yet to be shared and deserve to be heard. This is for me, and this is also for my soon-to-arrive little daughter. Thank you. Please let me know if there are any questions, and I will do my best to answer them.